I spoke to one multi-generational family earlier, and the grandmother was all in for Donald Trump. She said she couldn't understand how anyone would vote for Kamala Harris. And then her grandson said, "Okay, Granny, don't listen, but I'm voting for Kamala Harris."
Hey, Caitríona, it's just the two of us this week. Katty is on
Yeah.
a well-deserved vacation. You're on a trip, not a vacation, though. Tell us where you are.
Not a vacation, no. I am in Michigan as part of our Voters' Voices series. I've been traveling around the state. We've been in 5 or 6 cities already, and I am talking to you now from Saginaw, from Levi's restaurant here. And if you hear lots of slurps and ums and ahs coming from around me, that's because it's kind of lunchtime here and everyone's digging into the house speciality, which is a potato and ham cream soup with melted cheese and spring onions scattered on top. And
Light fare for
looks
lunch.
delicious. I can see plenty of people tucking in there right now.
Last week I was in Pennsylvania, and Philly cheesesteaks are the big dish there. Of course, I'm a vegetarian, so I couldn't partake. So I'm hoping on my next trip there's something a bit more Sumi friendly.
Of course, we're chatting here today, Sumi, without Katty, but as part of our weekly catch up that we're doing all the way through to the election and a little bit beyond that, checking in on how the campaigns are getting on, what the voters are thinking about, what they're doing, because we'll be together in studio on election night, bringing all the results to everyone tuning in to BBC News. So it's really good to have this catch up and see what we've all noticed over the week.
Yeah.
The big event this week, of course, was that apparent assassination attempt on Donald Trump, as the FBI have disguised it. Of course, he was on his golf course in Florida in West Palm Beach on Sunday, and an individual was spotted by a Secret Service agent who was a hole ahead of Donald Trump on the course and spotted a rifle poking through the bushes. That individual has now been charged and is facing 2 federal gun crime charges, maybe more serious ones to come, who knows. But that really has dominated, at least in the early part of the week, didn't it? A lot of the chat, a lot about, one assassination attempt
It
is
did.
remarkable. 2 is something beyond extraordinary.
It really is. We were on the air pretty quickly at the BBC and down on the ground in West Palm Beach to cover what was happening. But as you said, it's stunning. It's shocking to see these now 2 attempts on Donald Trump's life. I think it's raised a lot of questions again about political violence in such a polarized atmosphere as we're heading towards the election. And, our BBC Verified team has been looking into what kind of security Donald Trump has, because that's going to be one of the questions going forward, isn't it, Caitríona? How do you protect Donald Trump as he continues to campaign, hold rallies and all the rest? He's someone who likes to be out and about. He does these OTRs in small settings where he gets out at a cafe and shakes people's hands. He does these big rallies as well. His fans are very enthusiastic, very exuberant. So there's no 100% security, but our BBC Verified team was looking into the fact that according to an author who's an expert on the Secret Service, so a sitting vice president and president get around 300 agents from the Secret Service assigned to them. A former president gets around 90 to 100 agents, and this expert believes that Donald Trump has around 80 assigned to him. But this is going to be a question going forward, as we've already heard being discussed in Congress and from Trump's campaign team as well. Should he have more resources, and do the Secret Service need more resources as well?
And of course, President Biden and the acting director of the Secret Service, Rowe, they did say this week that they have given Donald Trump what they call the highest level of security, and particularly since that first assassination attempt in July. But speaking to a few Secret Service agents and former Secret Service agents this week, they're talking about securing a golf course as being particularly difficult. I mean, golf courses by their nature are vast open spaces with trees, with bushes. Very, very hard to secure a fixed perimeter. Many of them don't have fixed perimeters, or, they're bordered by water perhaps on one side if it's a links course or whatnot. And so that presents an extra difficult challenge for the Secret Service. And they're talking now in the wake of what happened on Sunday about having to move the perimeter around Donald Trump's golf courses. So, when he wants to go and play golf, which of course is his right as a human being to be able to do that, that actually they're going to have to shut down more and more streets and roads around those golf courses to try and get to a place where they can have a secure perimeter where members of the public can't access or try to have access as close as they can to the president. But you raised an interesting point there a minute ago, Sumi, is will this inspire further acts of political violence? And that's something that I spoke to Jason Russell on our shows earlier in the week. Do you expect that we might see more violent acts like this, more political violence?
Yeah, I think it's possible. These events tend to attract copycats. So I think it's entirely possible that we could see somebody else make an attempt or try to get into a venue. I think it's very difficult to do, even in this situation, even though obviously it was a close call. The Secret Service did identify the threat and was able to neutralize it or at least eliminate it from being a threat. So the methodology ultimately worked, but certainly too close for comfort.
The other point I've heard from people outside of America is there's now a kind of fear or a concern about what might happen in this country on November 5th or afterwards, depending on what the result is. Is it going to lead to, civil disorder, public disorder, very serious scenes on the streets of this nation? Who knows?
Something I've been thinking about this week is actually something that was sparked by a wonderful email that we got from one of our viewers, listeners. And just to encourage everyone, if you do have questions for us, please do let us know. We love to get them and respond to them. But I'm going to read this out. This is from Mehak Chadahold from Denmark. And she wrote us, quote, "As a woman of color, I am interested in learning more about the role of gender and race in the race between Harris and Trump. It would be great if you could break it down for listeners in one of the upcoming episodes." So Mehak, that's just what we're going to do. Thanks again for the question. This is a really important question. And, gender and race in this election cycle, you really can't separate the two. But I do want to start with gender because, right off the bat, after Kamala Harris entered the race, Caitríona, we saw gender already enter the debate as we saw J.D. Vance talk about childless cat ladies when referring to Democrats and leaders in the Democratic Party, and also Kamala Harris referring to people without children, without biological children. And indeed, we saw the governor of Arkansas, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, double down on that this week in a way when she said, her kids keep her humble, and said Kamala Harris doesn't have anyone to keep her humble. So she's again referring to the fact that she doesn't have biological children. But,
although
in the
she
bigger
does
picture,
have two stepchildren, we should point
of course,
out, who she
of
cares very
course.
deeply about.
And those stepchildren have said that, she was mom a lot to them, that she played a very large role in their childhood and their upbringing as well. But I also was interested to think about the contrast between Kamala Harris running this campaign and Hillary Clinton, of course, in 2016, and the fact that the slogan for Hillary Clinton's campaign was "I'm with her." And Kamala Harris has not leaned into the fact that she is a woman. It's not something that has prominently played into her messaging. But you covered, that 2016 campaign. I'm wondering how you see the difference between these two.
It is very different. As you say, Hillary Clinton leaned into that, and she hadn't been leaning into that in the previous Democratic primary cycle when she had tried to get the nomination ahead of Barack Obama. So it was very noticeable that she had changed track when she was coming to try and seek the nomination, and as we know, successfully did, following on from Barack Obama. But I think it's interesting that Kamala Harris has chosen not to do that, because traveling around, not just Michigan here, but voters in general in America, there are people, male and female, who say they don't want a female president. And, perhaps that seems like an odd thing to say. In Ireland, we've had two female presidents. Young people in Ireland think a president can be a man or a woman. It hasn't happened in this country. And I think how close the race is, that Kamala Harris and her team have probably taken a decision that they're trying to appeal to as broad a swathe of people as they possibly can. And, she doesn't want to be seen to be getting anything just because she's a woman either, that she wants to be elected because she's the best person for the job. But it's very interesting to note that she hasn't made a big issue about that. I mean, even in the interview she did with Dana Bash on CNN, and she was asked about that and shown the picture of her grandniece listening to her at the DNC.
That's right, yeah.
That iconic photograph with the two little plaits on her grandniece's hair, looking up at Kamala Harris on the stage. And even then, she didn't kind of bite on the question that Dana Bash was putting to her about what it would mean for women and for women of colour in particular, should she be elected. So I think it must be something quite calculated. But of course, we've seen supporters more than happy to lean into the fact that she's a woman. And in those early days, all those record-breaking Zoom calls with,
Right.
black women for Kamala
Women
Harris,
for
white
Harris,
women
yeah.
for Kamala Harris, like every possible demographic Zoom call, each trying to outdo the one before in terms of how many people they had logging on.
Yeah. And, I've spoken to female voters who are supporting Kamala Harris who say, I'm supporting her because I think it's time for a woman to be president. So even if Kamala Harris is not messaging that herself, it's something that her supporters are. But, I wanted to talk about race as well, because that was the other part of Mehak's question. And it certainly has played, look, it was always going to play a role when you have a woman of color for the first time at the top of the ticket. But it played a role really from the start, didn't it? When you saw some high-ranking Republicans saying that Kamala Harris was a diversity hire, that's why she was the vice president. And that got quite a lot of pushback, of course, from Democrats, from President Biden himself as well. And then, you also saw fairly early on in July when Donald Trump sat down with the journalists from the National Association of Black Journalists, NABJ, when he was asked this question about Kamala Harris being a diversity hire. And he said, well, I didn't know that she was Black. I thought she was Indian, and then she turned Black. And what I found interesting is Kamala Harris also has not engaged really frontally on this either, has she? So she's said, same old playbook, here we go again. I want to move forward. And she did a bit on the debate stage, didn't she, though, Caitríona? She did say, it's a shame that you have this type of rhetoric from someone who's trying to divide us.
She has, but she really isn't kind of making that essential point of her campaign. I mean, even this week, she's done another interview again with three journalists, three black journalists in this case. And she was asked a question about what she would do for black communities, who, of course, as we know, statistically in this country are so disadvantaged, particularly young black men, less likely to own a home, more likely to be stopped by police, more likely to end up incarcerated. More likely to earn lower wages, to have a lower level of education. So Donald Trump is trying to attract that group of people with his message that, the deck is stacked against you, I can make things better for you. And so Kamala Harris yesterday, in this interview, when she was asked again about sort of messaging to Black African American communities of people of color, she chose to hone in on the economic message, saying at one point that, we can't operate, she said, from the assumption that black men are in anybody's pocket. Black men are like any other voting group. You've got to earn their vote. So I'm working to earn their vote. And she went on then to talk about how she would make things better in terms of jobs, equality, housing, and all of those issues that appeal to all kinds of people, really.
And that sounded in a way, Caitríona, like an admission that in the past, Democrats had taken those votes and those voters for granted, hadn't they? And I think that was also an admission that if you look at some of the numbers, some of that support among young black men has been softening for Democrats as they turn a bit more to Donald Trump, particularly on that economic messaging. But it's just, I found it remarkable as well, thinking about the fact that President Obama, his time in office, he didn't lean into his identity as a black man either, right? And, it's interesting, Caitríona, I've noticed even in the way that race is being discussed in how Kamala Harris speaks, there's been this criticism, at least from commentators online or on X on Twitter, formerly Twitter, of how she changes her diction or style of speaking if she's in New York, for example, versus down in Georgia, and how she adapts the way that she speaks. It's been described by some Republican commentators as not being authentic because she puts on a Southern accent, let's say. But black commentators have made the point that, look, this is called code switching. So code switching is something that you do see when people speak different languages, let's say, or have different backgrounds and can slip into different dialects. And, these commentators have made the point, look, that's exactly what Kamala Harris is doing. She has a Black Jamaican father, a South Indian mother. So she's grown up in different contexts and likely, as these commentators have said, is used to speaking in different ways to different groups because, she's spent her life on the West Coast and now is on the East Coast. Even that can affect the way that you speak to either a group of people or versus your own family. So I found it really interesting that there, too, you see this underlining of race, even in the way that Kamala Harris delivers it. And it's triggered that debate online of, is she authentic or is she putting on this voice for a certain group? And again, for Black Americans, they say this is a part of the vernacular of the culture.
Okay, so I am here in Michigan. As I said earlier, I've been traveling around several of the cities here, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about what I've been hearing from voters here, because of course we look at all the polls and they show this race to be in a dead heat. I was looking at the polls that have been carried out since the debate. There are four of them. Three of them, Kamala Harris is ahead by only 1 or 2%, though. So that's within the margin of error of each of those polls. So essentially, that means that poll is neutralized. And in another poll, both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are tied. It's a dead heat. So this state, at this point in time, and so far as we know, is billed as a toss up state. It's for either to win. Just to put into context, of course, Joe Biden won it in 2020. Donald Trump won it in 2016. Donald Trump winning it then by only 0.23%, a couple of thousand votes, very, very little. Joe Biden margin was a little greater, but still really, really small, less than 3%. Where I am here in Saginaw City at the moment, Joe Biden won by only 300 votes in this city. So
Wow.
the margins, when you break it down into districts, are really tiny. And talking to voters here, many of them have said, unprovoked, they don't talk politics with each other here anymore because it's just so divisive. And people were losing friendships, they were losing members of their family. I spoke to one multi-generational family earlier, and the grandmother was, all in for Donald Trump. She said she couldn't understand how anyone would vote for Kamala Harris. She said even as a woman, she couldn't understand how anyone would use the argument that if you're a woman, you should vote for Kamala Harris. And then her grandson said, okay, Granny, don't listen, but I'm voting for Kamala Harris. And his sister...
That's going to be a topic at the Thanksgiving
yeah,
table,
and his
isn't it?
sister mouthed to me, I'm doing the same, but I have to say that people saying they're voting for Kamala Harris is way less than I would have anticipated or I've seen in past cycles here. And, we're in Saginaw, we were in Flint yesterday, people there really feeling left behind. It's 10 years on from the water crisis, if you can imagine that. There are still people who don't have clean drinking water in Flint. They haven't received the compensation that was due to them. Everywhere you go in this part of the state, there is visible decline. Beautiful buildings, but have no one in them. So the windows are smashed, parts of the bricks are falling down, boarded up half of the main street or the high street. So jobs go, people go, and it's, unfortunately a negative spiraling cycle. Then we were in Dearborn and Detroit. And of course, Dearborn is a majority Muslim American city. It's home to the biggest Muslim American and Arab American population in the United States. I was there in April when people were kind of humming and hawing. What would they do? They were very angry about Joe Biden's support of Israel in terms of, what the bombing in Gaza, the attacks on Gaza. And they were kind of having these meetings with the administration, with senior ranking Democrats. We saw what happened in the primary here in Michigan. Over 100,000 people in the Democratic primary would not vote for Joe Biden. They declared themselves uncommitted, which was their way of sending a message to him. That was April. Here now, in the end of September, in Dearborn yesterday at the end of September, the amount of people that said, I've made up my mind, I'm not voting for the Democrats. I'm voting for Donald Trump, or I'm voting for the Green Party candidate, Jill Stein. And, they'd say, I acknowledge that it's probably a wasted vote, that, she may not win this state and it's unlikely she'd win enough states to be elected. But I just cannot bring myself to vote for Kamala Harris or any Democrat because of what's happening. And the way they put it was, many of them, we were born here, we pay our tax dollars here, we were educated here, we are American, we pledge allegiance to this country, but our tax dollars are being used to bomb, essentially in support of Israel's military campaign. It's being used to, as they said, bomb and kill our neighbors, our friends, our cousins, our brothers, our sisters, our grandparents in countries in the Middle East, in Gaza in particular. And they said, how can we do that? We're put in this impossible situation of being loyal citizens, paying our taxes, and knowing where that money is going.
And Caitríona, do they feel that there's been any change between Joe Biden and Kamala Harris? Because, certainly when we saw that change at the top of the ticket and Kamala Harris had that press conference when Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu visited Washington, D.C., and you were covering that at the Capitol, she held that press conference where many of the Muslim American and Arab American voices we spoke to afterwards were at least happy with the fact that, as they put it, they felt that she could hold both thoughts at the same time, namely supporting Israel, but also understanding Palestinian suffering and giving a voice to Palestinian suffering. And they had hoped for a change in policy, I understand. And in fact, I was at that rally in Detroit with Kamala Harris about a month ago now, where it was interrupted by Gaza protesters. And she was criticized for interrupting them and saying, if you want to vote for Donald Trump, that's fine, but otherwise I'm speaking. It was seen as perhaps not at all in tune with what those protesters are calling for. But do they see then any difference between Harris and Biden?
They don't at this point. Many of them said to me that they thought at one point when she took over at the top of the ticket that things might be different and that she was expressing more empathy, more understanding of the humanitarian situation. But they say they've asked for, the community leaders have asked repeatedly for meetings with her. They've asked for her to tell them exactly what she intends to do should she be re-elected. With regards to Israel, they point to the debate last week when the issue arose. And she said, wholeheartedly that she believed in Israel's right to defend itself and that the US would remain a staunch ally of Israel. And they just feel that the road has run out essentially. We spoke to in excess of, heading for 30 or more individuals, and all of them had the same viewpoint, which was either they couldn't decide and they didn't want to vote for Donald Trump, or they were going to vote for Donald Trump or Jill Stein, that they just had had enough. And I suppose not helped this week by the images that they were seeing coming from Lebanon. We spoke to a number of members of the Lebanese community as well, many of whom told me how they had cousins who had lost an eye. Another lady had a cousin who'd lost fingers and a hand as those devices exploded in Lebanon this week. One individual told me about her cousin who was a doctor working in a hospital, and his pager had exploded. So there's a lot of anger there that they feel, things aren't getting better. In fact, they're getting worse. And people were a lot more disappointed and vocally against Democrats than when I had spoken to them in April. And they just felt there was nothing at this point that could win them back.
That's so critical, Caitríona, because you were saying in Saginaw, the difference in the 2020 election was 300 votes. I mean, imagine if you're talking to 30 some individuals who say that they're not going to cast their ballot or perhaps cast their ballot for Jill Stein. But that could be all the difference for the Democrats there.
That's it. I mean, you're talking in such small margins in Michigan that you have a community like that who kind of all are feeling the same way. And I said to them, if there is a ceasefire, if there is a deal done between now and election day, would that change your mind? They all seem to have quite a disappointing or a pessimistic view of whether a deal was even possible at this stage. And, what would a deal look like? Are you talking about just getting to that first step of the three-part plan that Joe Biden unveiled at the end of May, in which case they said that's not good enough. They don't, like, a couple of days or a week pause is not a permanent deal. The things they need Kamala Harris to say, she's not saying. So that was quite informative for me, just in terms of, and it's obviously not scientific, but in terms of taking the temperature of people and just the level of anger and the level of upset and disappointment, and really people just agonizing over wanting to belong in this country and pay their taxes and respect the rules, but at the same time being conscious of what was happening to their tax dollars.
Okay, Caitríona, really interesting insights from Michigan. I know we're going to be on the road in these swing states, gathering all of these voices and hopefully gathering lots of good meals as well on the road. So I want to let you get back to that diner and perhaps try, what was that dish again?
Oh, that was the cream of potato and ham soup with melted
Right.
cheese and spring onion. But I can say, Sumi, that I have already secured for us a delicious cinnamon loaf with some, guilty but good icing on the top. So I have that stuck in my suitcase. We can have it with our tea next week.
Ooh, looking forward to that. Thanks for the gifts. I have to remember that for my next trip on the road, to bring back gifts, of course. But thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We're going to be back next week with Katty, of course, on the path for the presidency. And we'll be on together once a week from now until Election Day. So do join us here again next week.